Welcome to the EPG Pathshala Linguistics course. I'm Prabal Dasgupta from the Indian Statistical Institute, Kolkata. I'm responsible for the Morphology and Syntax paper in this course. In this session, we shall do module 27, which looks at the role of triggers in the grammar. The objective of this module is to place the various triggers you have been looking at on a piecemeal basis, case by case, on a theoretical footing. We begin by noting that a lexical trigger is some lexical element present in the structural description of a transformation, which causes that transformation to apply. For example, raising to subject is lexically triggered by the raising predicates likely and unlikely. But even though probable and improbable are basically synonyms of likely and unlikely, those lexical items do not trigger raising to subject. We understand this. We have established this in several modules and you are used to the idea by now. Now, a structural description mentions several kinds of elements that are relevant to deciding whether a particular tree does or does not invite the application of that specific transformation. In particular, you often find in the structural description of a transformation elements like plus WH, minus WH, or person, number, gender features, which are going to be copied or operated on in an agreement operation or some other kind of transformation that is sensitive to features rather than to lexical items. So we need a more general term for those elements that are present in the structural description of a transformation and whose presence is essential to make the transformation apply. Lexical triggers are not the only elements with this property. Those other elements can therefore be called, for the lack of a better term, syntactic stimuli. Bearing in mind the role that lexical triggers and syntactic stimuli play, and bearing in mind the fact that the lexical triggers do their work by virtue of those particular lexical entries, and not by virtue of the meaning which is shared between likely and probable or shared between unlikely and improbable, let us consider some problems for such a characterization of what is going on. Examples 1 ABC from ordinary English. John imparted to Bill the ability to speak French. Bill received from John the ability to speak French. John is good at imparting the ability to speak French. Must be presumed to be operating on a deep structure in which A has a volatile subject X he in the downstairs infinitival clause. B has the same volatile subject there. But C does not have a volatile subject he that gets co-indexed with Bill. Instead, in the third sentence, 1C, John is good at imparting the ability to speak French. We have to presume that the downstairs subject of to speak French is a volatile that we write as X with a subscript arb, ARB, short for arbitrary. In other words, a referential index that says anybody, it doesn't matter who. In other words, the surface structure John is good at imparting the ability to speak French has the meaning John is good at imparting the ability for anybody to speak French, whoever it is that he is teaching. The difficulty that these examples pose for what has been said about lexical triggers and syntactic stimuli is that the determination of the antecedent in the matrix clause, Bill, with which the downstairs subject that gets controlled, whose deletion gets controlled, X he, is a determination that seems to depend on semantic factors, not on syntactic factors alone. In other words, impart the ability and receive the ability have these distinct properties. not by virtue of the syntax, but because of the meaning of impart and receive, which point in opposite directions. It is clear that the resources we have given you so far with lexical triggers and syntactic stimuli and other kinds of syntactic gadget do not suffice to handle the facts of 1a, b, and c. What should we do in the face of such data? Should we abandon the idea that the triggers are lexical? Should we imagine that actually they're semantic triggers and we were falsely identifying them with lexical items rather than meanings? Should we imagine that in fact likely has a slightly different meaning from probable, and that is why likely triggers raising to subject and probable doesn't, and so on? Should we say these are semantic stimuli, not lexical triggers? We could be tempted to follow that path, but it's a temptation. It is not a solution. Because if we were to replace the whole theory of lexical triggers with a theory of semantic triggers, we would expect words and their synonyms in other languages to have the same properties as far as triggering is concerned. That expectation is not satisfied. In French, it is possible for the verb sembler, which has exactly the same meaning as English, seem, to serve as a control trigger. Thus, in example 2 in French, il nous semble nous trouver face à une crise, which literally translates as, it seems to us to find ourselves before a crisis, which is French for it seems to us that we are facing a crisis. It is quite obvious in such a sentence that seem triggers a control operation, a controlled deletion operation, in which the upstairs object, us, controls the deletion of the downstairs subject, which is a volatile version of we. If this were possible in English, we would be able to say, it seems to us to be facing a crisis, and convey the meaning, we seem to be facing a crisis. In fact, if you wish to use the string, it seems to us to be facing a crisis in English, that can only mean we think it is facing a crisis. It's like the government, the party, the institution, or something else. It seems to us to be facing a crisis as a string of words in English cannot possibly mean that it seems to us that we are facing a crisis, though it can routinely mean that in French. This shows that throwing out the theory of lexical triggers and trying to install a theory of semantic triggers will immediately run into empirical difficulties. Perhaps some imaginable future theory of semantics, which makes extremely delicate distinctions and enables us to say that likely and probable have different shades of meaning, that French semblé isn't really a translation of English seem, and so on. A future theory of semantics that gets all these details right and more might perhaps be able to replace a theory of lexical triggering with one of semantic triggering. Alas, we are quite far from such an attainment. Nobody is in a position to give such a theory. There isn't even an advanced semantics we can hand wave at. So we are stuck with lexical triggers and with the admission that this theory doesn't cover all the facts. There appear to be some semantic triggering effects, but there's nothing much we can do about it in our grammatical theory. Let us now go into the details of lexical triggering or transformations, setting aside the wider theoretical issues. Let us look at the narrow application of transformations and the role that triggering elements play in the context of this application at a mechanical level. All the discussion we've had through all these modules of the paper about triggering have assumed that one is talking about a particular item sponsoring a rule, a particular item saying, I make the rule happen, I invite the rule to come and apply. Sometimes the opposite happens. There are rules that apply in the overwhelming majority of cases so that no special invitation card is necessary to get the rule to come and apply. But the opposite is true. There are a tiny handful of exceptions which do not want that rule to apply and that have to raise their hand and say so. Excuse me, dear rule so-and-so, don't apply to a sentence in which I occur. You can informally call such elements anti-triggers. There are lexical anti-triggers that serve the function of preventing a rule from applying, even though the rule applies to the overwhelming majority of the companions of that item that otherwise belong to the same category as that item. To take an actual example, in Hindi, as we've been telling you ad infinitum, transitive verbs in the perfect tenses, in tenses associated with the perfect aspect and in the past tense. In other words, the perfect tenses is a technical term in Hindi morphology. Take the ergative case marking on the subject. This is a fact about the perfect tenses and transitive verbs in Hindi Urdu. However, it is not a fact about absolutely all the verbs in Hindi Urdu that are transitive. There is a tiny handful, those very few verbs in Hindi Urdu, even when they appear in the past tense or in the present perfect, past perfect and future perfect, do not take ergative case marking and do not allow the object to control verb agreement. One such verb is lana, to bring. Another such verb is bolna, to say. Bolna is here distinct from कहना. कहना takes the ergative, it's a regular verb. Bolna is an exceptional verb and it anti-triggers the ergative. It tells the ergative not to apply the ergative pattern, the ergative transformation. Obviously, anti-triggering is a special case of triggering. Triggering is a general term for giving instructions. Ordinarily, we speak of triggering when some item gives an instruction for a transformation to apply. But in the tiny minority of cases where certain items have this bizarre property of telling a particular rule not to apply, that also is an instruction, you see. They are triggering non-application of the process. In that sense, you can call them all triggers. We have urged you in one of our exercises at this point to consider certain exceptions to the generalization in English syntax that all transitive verbs permit passivization. We ask you to look at John married Susan, which doesn't turn into Susan was married by John unless John is a priest who is performing the ceremony for Susan to get married to somebody else. We've noted that David weighs 70 kilos, doesn't passivize into 70 kilos are weighed by David. And that Ram resembles Shyam doesn't passivize into Shyam is resembled by Ram. So far we've been doing the mechanics and very broad thematic considerations about triggers, stimuli, can the lexical element be replaced entirely by the semantics, and so on. There is something closer to the core of syntactic reasoning that is relevant to the study of lexical triggers. And the real hidden agenda of this module is to bring you face to face, or rather to begin to bring you face to face with that deeper question. It is at the boundary of our understanding of what is going on. When you go through the cases, you begin to suspect that lexical triggering has something to do with specifically cyclic transformations. You begin to notice that none of the root transformations you come across in any language seem to require or to call for a lexical trigger. you begin to wonder why this pattern is emerging. Why are lexical triggers somehow associated with the transformational cycle? Why do they not want to do anything with the root transformations? What is going on here? At this point, we give you exercise 3. When you're trying to understand theoretical points, it is very important to make the right distinctions. We ask you to think about whether, if you find that root transformations never invoke lexical triggers, whether you can jump to the conclusion that therefore the root sentence is lexical trigger free. Can you jump to the conclusion that there are no lexical triggers in the root sentence from the premise? Imagine that the premise is valid, that lexical triggers play no role in root transformations. This is a trick question, and we hope that you will recognize the trap and not walk straight into it. Before we accept the premise that root transformations are never lexically triggered, it is our duty to examine possible counterexamples. In fact, to go through any root transformation we can find that shows the slightest sign of having the kind of trigger that we are talking about. We have to kind of circle around the area looking for counterexamples before we declare that we found something. There is a process in Bangla that applies only in root sentences and is therefore a root process that takes a future tense verb, doubles it, and sandwiches a dissociative emphasizer particle E in the middle, a focus particle. So you get, we absolutely will go to Dilip's house tomorrow, coming out as sentence 7. Amra kalke, we tomorrow, Dilipper barite, to Dilip's house. Jaboi jabo. Will go, focus particle, will go. Now this is a peculiar root process. It is tied to certain very interesting coordinates. It only applies to future tense verbs, not to anything else. If instead of jabo, we will go, if the sentence had gallo, went, you cannot say galloi gallo. If it is a present progressive, jacche, is going, you cannot say jacchei jacche. You need a future. Now consider bare object quantifier preposing. When you state that transformation, assuming for the argument's sake that kono, which means any, is the only quantifier that undergoes it. In fact, a few more do, but that doesn't matter. Let's pretend that kono is the only item to undergo postposing in bare object quantifier postposing. Could you argue that since the transformation in such a case mentions kono specifically, that kono is a word and therefore there is a lexical item that triggers the root transformation bare object quantifier postposing? No, you cannot, because kono is a functor, it is a functional element. It is exhaustively specified when its syntactic features are enumerated. The comparative preposition than, or the existential quantifier some, or the universal quantifier all. Functional items like this are not lexical items because their features exhaust their content. A contentive, which is what we mean by a lexical item, such as carrot or jump or shallow, has a unique signature. That is where its semantics comes from. These lexical items cannot be exhausted by giving a list of the features. Let us look in the other direction. Let us look at lexical items that are promising candidates and say, these occur only in root sentences. Gee, it would be nice if it were to turn out that they trigger root transformations. Do they? Let us examine them one by one. Look at the interjection, wow, look at the interjection hey. Is there a hey transformation? Is there a wow transformation? Do they trigger anything? You can keep looking, maybe you will find something interesting, but I doubt it. None of us has ever heard of a transformation triggered by hey or wow. What about the emphatic echo noun transformation that we discussed a few modules ago? In Hindi, Urdu, you can say, "Use chai chahiye chai," tea, what he wants is tea. You get the same thing in Bangla. Yeah, that's a lexical item. You're talking about tea in this example. But you see, it isn't as if the transformation looks for tea. It looks for a noun, it doesn't care what the noun is. And it then copies the noun. That's not triggered by a lexical item, it's triggered by a category. A category is something syntactic, it is not lexical. So your search draws a blank once more. You can keep looking, and we encourage you to keep looking. The only way to gauge the status of a hypothesis in any exact discipline is to keep strenuously looking for possible counterexamples. Sometimes people do successfully find a counterexample, and then they upset a theory that had been accepted for centuries as valid. This has happened in several disciplines. We are not claiming that this hypothesis, associating lexical triggers with cyclic transformations alone, is carved in stone and will appear to be valid for several centuries down the line, and that there never will be a counterexample. We haven't found one yet. But you should keep looking. Maybe you are going to be the person who will find one. Let us now begin to try to understand why the language system needs lexical triggers and syntactic stimuli. What work are they doing? Yes, we understand how we are making them serve the purposes of our machinery. That is not the question we're now addressing. We're now asking, why does the design of language need this dependency on particular lexical triggers and syntactic stimuli? What is going on? What is the deeper meaning of all this? The deeper meaning, as far as we understand, is that when something gets deleted or moved, and remember that movement is a kind of deletion because the material gets deleted in its original spot and then reappears somewhere else. So it boils down to, when material gets deleted, there has to be some way for the listener to figure out what got deleted. Otherwise, if the listener cannot retrieve it, you're making a mockery of the whole understanding that deep structure is associated with meaning and that transformations cannot touch the meaning. That theory only works if you can rigorously guarantee that every deleted item can be recovered. This is where triggers and syntactic stimuli come in. They surround the site of deletion with safeguards, making sure that anything getting deleted is going to remain retrievable, traceable. Think of certain libraries that work on the principle that when a book is taken out of the shelf and lent to somebody or even put on the table for reading, one has to take the index card out of the book and place the index card on the shelf in that position where the book was supposed to be. In those libraries, especially if with the index card there is a convention for writing down, hello, I'm so and so, I'm placing the index card here, I'm taking the book to such and such a place. With such a convention, the library will easily be able to retrieve a book that has been removed from its original position. Why? Because there is an extra indexical element telling you how to retrieve it. This is a metaphor for the work that we are claiming gets done by lexical triggers and syntactic stimuli. Consider sentences 8 and 9. John persuaded Sally to leave. John promised Sally to leave. They look nearly identical except that the verbs are different. Persuade and promise. But their meanings are not identical at all. Apart from the lexical meanings of persuade and promise being different, the two sentences have different orientations. John persuaded Sally to leave is about Sally leaving. John promised Sally to leave is about John leaving. What role do the lexical triggers persuade and promise play in making the sentences have these different semantic profiles? The answer to that question is persuade triggers object-controlled deletion of the downstairs subject. Promise triggers subject-controlled deletion of the downstairs subject. Because these are triggers of different control operations in the grammar, they ensure that the meaning can be retrieved by the listener, that the listener is able to figure out which of the NPs in the matrix sentence is the antecedent of the downstairs subject whose deletion got controlled by that antecedent. Why? Because the control relation is mediated by the lexical trigger, the verb persuade or promise, which keeps tabs on where the antecedent is and where the control deletion site is. That was the case in which lexical triggers alone make the recovery process possible. Sentence 10 gives you an instance where the recovery process is a collaborative project of lexical triggers and syntactic stimuli. In 10, who did John say Susan believed Jill would marry? There is a series of plus WH placeholders along the way that who has successively moved into on its way to the top, to the root sentence. In addition, there are bridge verbs like say and believe on the way, which, unlike the non-bridge verbs scream, murmur, shout, etc., authorize WH movement to continue on its upward path. So what enables you to retrieve the meaning of who did John say Susan believed Jill would marry is not just a series of plus WH placeholders, which were syntactic stimuli that made WH movement keep happening. Another factor is the bridge verbs say and believe, which sponsored successive cyclic WH movement in sentence 10. These ideas begin to help us to see why it might be the case that lexical triggers are not associated with root transformations. But as you can see, they only help you to formulate half an answer. Those lexical triggers, like triggers of raising to subject, or triggers of control deletion, or triggers of successive cyclic WH movement, they are responsible for something getting deleted or moved across a clause boundary between one clause and another. If that is the main task for lexical triggers, then it stands to reason that you will get no lexical triggers among the root transformations, because by definition, root transformations only look at the material in the root sentence. They never look across a clause boundary. But that doesn't exhaust our problem. There could have been exclamative root transformations that are lexically triggered by some kind of interjection like hey or wow. And those transformations could have been built around the interjection. They might have involved repeating the interjection for all you know. As we keep thinking about the theoretical problem, we move closer to the outline of an answer, if not to a complete answer. If you look at the root transformations you have seen so far, topicalization, tag formation, and so on, you will see that all the special effects associated with these processes draw your attention to certain special facts, certain attention-worthy facts about the state of affairs portrayed in the utterance. You're drawing attention. Now, to draw attention, you sometimes repeat some information in left dislocation, the chairman's nephew, he's a real nuisance. Right dislocation, he's a real nuisance, the chairman's nephew. Here, there's a pronoun that repeats the person, number, gender features of the highlighted NP. So the special effects of root transformations have to do with highlighting, foregrounding, and so on. That tends to be what they do. If you're going to foreground something, you wouldn't dream of deleting it. In contrast, when you look at the syntactic properties of embedded clauses and of processes that take place in embedded clauses, you find that the tendency of the syntactic system is to shorten an embedded clause, delete a subject, delete a relative pronoun, do this or that to mangle the embedded clause and make it smaller, more compact, and so on. When you have deletion going on, some lexical trigger, some syntactic stimulus or other witness will say, I was watching this as it got deleted, so I can tell you what got deleted and help you to bring it back to life. If this story is on the right track, root processes expand, highlight, underline, and they don't delete. Whereas cyclic processes sometimes delete, sometimes shorten, sometimes do things to make the embedded sentences more compact or smaller. Therefore, root processes need to be monitored, cyclic processes need to be monitored and checked and kept under control by these lexical triggers and syntactic stimuli, which will help the listener to retrieve deleted material. And root processes will not have any such need. The occasion won't arise for such a retrieval. This is not absolutely a complete and foolproof answer to the question, why should it make sense that cyclic processes harbor lexical triggers and that root processes don't. In particular, notice that we have not postulated any contrast between the roles that syntactic stimuli play in root processes and in cyclic transformations. Evidently, there are syntactic stimuli present in both kinds of processes, and we wouldn't dream of denying that they are. What we are urging you to think about is the possibility that perhaps lexical triggers are associated only with the transformational cycle, never with root transformations. And we have offered the outline of an answer to the question, why should this be so? This is a topic at the boundary of our understanding. We are very close to the limit of what can be done with the machinery that we have and the examples that we have access to. We urge you, however, to keep pushing the envelope, to keep exploring the frontiers of your understanding as you keep learning. It is partly to set an example of such curiosity that we are encouraging you to examine the hypothesis that perhaps lexical triggers appear only in connection with cyclic transformations and not with root transformations. Even though we know that such a hypothesis is far from being securely established. It is time to summarize what we have tried to do in this module. We took a close theoretical look at lexical triggers to see what role they play in the grammar and to place them in the context of anti-triggering, of syntactic stimuli that are not lexical, and also to situate them in terms of finding which parts of the grammar make use of lexical triggers. We give you some considerations bearing on the possibility that perhaps only cyclic transformations harbor lexical triggers and that root transformations never do so. We began to give an outline of an answer to the question why this might be so. Many of the details are worked out in the e-text. You will find supplementary reading suggestions in the e-text for this and other modules. We invite you to give us whatever feedback you come up with as you explore these and other frontiers. We assure you that if there is feedback that leads us to change our mind about something, we will say so. And we thank you for your attention.